the YouTube has started. So I'm going to bring up our PowerPoint. I have a squeaky voice today. I don't know why. All right. So where we ended yesterday is we were talking about three theories that really started off this field that we call psychology. So if you remember, we started with the basics, the very basics. We started with structuralism versus functionalism. And structuralism is if you think the amygdala explains emotion, you're a structuralist. If you wonder why is it that we have sadness or happiness, what is its purpose, you're a functionalist. If you're and again, you can be both. Don't get me wrong on this. If you're both, you kind of can. And I will tell you, for those who I know are going to go on hopefully and do your dissertation and whatnot, you will have to have a functionalist approach. So you'll have to talk about the neurobiology of whatever your topic is, and you'll have to have a functionalist approach. What is its purpose? Why? And so, for example, again, my dissertation was on identity and loneliness and how identity influences loneliness. So what is the purpose of loneliness, and what is the purpose of identity, and what are the relationships? But I also had to have a chapter on what are the brain processes, what are the structures within the brain that give away to loneliness or to thinking about our identity, okay? And then we started with three very early theories. We started with Sigmund Freud because he was one of the first to give us a formalized theory. And as I mentioned, there's two important aspects of Sigmund Freud's theory. One, him and Dr. Brunner are if you want to say, the roots of modern Western psychotherapy and counseling. They're the ones that started the talking cure. They're the ones that stated if you have a psychological problem, you need to come to an expert who can understand what your brain, what I shouldn't say brain, your mind processes are, because you may not have access to them. Okay. And again, if we want to look at popular culture, this is why when someone is having really psychological distress, we don't say, come talk to me. We say, go see a counselor or go see your doctor, because we think we don't have the expertise to do that. If you have that in your mind as a response to someone who has experienced psychological distress, you're being a Freudian psychoanalyst when you're doing that. But this is the basis of modern Western psychotherapy and counseling. The next two, we talked about behaviorism, and we talked about in this one, what the main things I want to talk about is, yes, we will get to the learning section where we'll talk about reinforcement. We'll talk about things like associative learning and those things. The main thing I want you to think about as an influence on modern psychology is its behaviorism that established scientific ways of examining the mind and mental processes. We're going to see here in just a minute something called the cognitive revolution, which states that, you know what, human beings and most animals, if we want to put it that way, most species are more complex than a pigeon pecking at a switch to get a treat, or a mouse running through a maze. That there's so much diversity in the mental processes of human beings that behavior isn't predictable just based upon reward and punishment. But with the cognitive revolution, they're still going to use the same scientific protocol to examine mental processes. So this is going to establish the idea that psychology needs to examine even things like mental life in a very observational, very standardized way, so that it can be replicated and it can be kind of like global warming. There can be evidence that builds for an idea, or there's evidence that says, on the other hand, no, there's these certain situations where this does not apply. Okay. And then we talked about, and remember that both these theories were deterministic. We get into the 1950s with humanistic theory. If I were to explain humanistic theory in modern psychology, humanistic theory was the grandfather of what we call positive psychology. A major portion of psychology has studied, and again, when I go back to this, when I go back to the myth of psychology, about 53% of psychologists are clinical counseling psychologists. So they study the people who are having difficulties in life. They're studying people who have a hard time adapting to life because of some psychological or behavioral disorder or inhibition. Okay. But if you remember what humanistic theory says, is it says that everybody wants to achieve their complete potential. Okay. And in 1999, I actually have the American Psychologist thing in my dresser drawer because I want to keep it there. In 1999, Bandura, was it Bandura? No, it wasn't Bandura. No, it wasn't. I can't remember his name right at the moment. Wrote kind of a manifesto about what we call positive psychology. Positive psychology are psychologists who study people who are high performers, and they want to know what makes people who measure really high on happiness happy. They want to know what makes people who become very successful in their life successful. They're the ones that study things like high performing sports stars. They're the people who study very successful parent and family systems, where the majority of the children in that family become successful and happy people in their own right. Okay. And it's in this idea of studying people who are achieving their full potential came from this humanistic approach that we all want to achieve our full greatness. And now positive psychology is trying to figure out how can we help people who want to achieve complete happiness, want to achieve amazing relationships, want to achieve even things like financial success or high performance in what other area in their life. How can we use what we know about these individuals to help these individuals become that? Okay. And so this is the grandfather of what we now call positive psychology. Okay. The other aspect of humanistic psychology is I mentioned Freud and Bruner as kind of the roots of psychotherapy, but humanistic theory is also going to have a huge impact on therapy. Carl Rogers was a clinical psychologist. He was a counseling psychologist. And he went into the humanistic approach about how the relationship between a therapist and a client should go. What should that relationship be? And one of the posits that we really didn't talk about yesterday about the humanistic approach is humanistic approach argues that we all inherently know the answers to our problems. And it takes, though, that therapeutic relationship and that human connection for a person to understand the solutions that are already there inside that individual. So if you want to think about sitcoms where the person is laying on the couch And the therapist is sitting there going, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the client goes, well, doc, what do you think my problem is? And the therapist goes, well, what do you think the problem is? Okay. In humanistic therapy, you don't give your opinion. What you do is you set the environment for that client to continually explore their mind and their behaviors and their mental states to where they establish the solution. Okay. So if you think about those memes, what do you think? And they never really give an answer. What they're showing in that sitcom is the humanistic approach to therapy. Now, I will state this: pure humanistic approach normally isn't used completely in the therapeutic process. But almost every counselor, therapist, and whatnot that is trained well uses the humanistic approach to develop the relationship, the therapeutic relationship with their client, to establish this relationship. And when we get to abnormal psychology, I will talk about clients who only go to 1 or 2 sessions and don't come after that. And the reason is actually going to be because of this humanistic approach and the ability to go to someone and tell that person anything you want without any judgment, without worrying that they're going to go tell someone, without any repercussions, as you would say. And we find that those 1 or 2 sessions, when you have that ability, is very therapeutic. But I'll talk more about that when we get to the abnormal section. The next camps of psychology use psychoanalysis, use humanistic theory, use behaviorism to explain different aspects of human existence. Okay. And so the next two camps in psychology are what we call social psychology and developmental psychology. Okay. Social psychology is the study of human interaction. I'm going to put it just that way. But it's not only human interaction, it's imagined interaction. So in every situation, we're always wondering, well, if someone saw me do that, what would they think? That's a social psychological concept. And so social psychology is a study of the interaction between individuals and their social system and how they influence each other. And when we get to that section, we're going to find two major theoretical ideas. Okay. And the first one is called situationalism, and the other one is subjective experience. Okay. And I'm going to try and summarize this very easily. Okay. Let's say we had a live class today. So you came on campus and you came to a classroom. Okay. When you walk into that room, you probably wouldn't go up to the lecture podium or the IT desk where the PowerPoint is being developed and going to be presented on the screens and whatnot. You wouldn't go there. Okay. You'd probably see these tables or these desks that probably are empty. They have nothing on it. And you'd automatically go and sit at that table. Okay. And then let's say if I came into the room, I would probably go up to the lecture podium, or I would go to the IT station and set up the PowerPoint that you're all seeing today on Zoom. And that is the idea of situationalism, that you may be someone who needs to constantly be standing. You may be someone who is very active. But in that situation, you will play the role of student and you'll come in and you'll sit down at a seat. Okay. If you're the teacher, you would come in, not sit at one of those seats, but you'd go to your lectern or to your place where the teacher sits and gets ready for the day's lesson. Okay. This is the idea of situationalism. Now, even though for the most part, and I will give a story about this really quick. I'll do a quick story so you kind of remember what situationalism is all about. I had a social psychology class, and the students in this class were staunchly independent. They staunchly disagreed that they could be forced to do a behavior based upon the situation and the environment demands. They believe that they chose to do what they do. Okay. So in order to show this, one day before a class, I set up one student desk, took all the rest out of the room. I took the lecture podium out of the room, and I took all of those out of the room. I put some chairs around, so there was the option to sit at a chair, and I sat in that student desk. Okay. Now this was only this. This wasn't when they got to know me. This was in the second or third lecture in in a social psychology class. And it was interesting what these staunchly independent, thinking they make the decisions to do what they want to do, did. They came in the classroom, and the majority of them left because they weren't sure what to do. They didn't know what their behavior should be. Even though there were chairs, even though there was places to stand, a lot of them just kind of walked back out. And then a lot of them just stood there trying to figure out what their behavior should be. And if they were staunchly independent and make the choice to do what they do, they should have either sat on the floor, sat at a chair, stood there if they prefer standing, and they would have allowed me to sit there at the student desk doing the lecture. Okay. So, my point being is situationalism is that we often do the behaviors that are demanded by the situation we are in. Okay. Now, let's take this a step further, because you notice this bolded word that says subjective experience. So social psychologists can predict behavior very well. We can predict what people will do in almost any given situation, given the situational variables. But the why people performed that way is not predictable. Okay. So in the situation in the classroom, where you come in and just like every other student, you sit at a student table or student desk. If I went around and asked each one of you why you chose to sit where you sat or do what you did, you would all give me a slightly different answer. Okay, so while behavior can be predictable based on the situation, the reason why people engage in that behavior is very subjective. And so this comes down to the question, right? Well, if behavior is so predictable, why do some people go to college and some people don't? Why do some people choose labor work versus educational work or executive work? And this comes down to the subjective experience of people. This comes down to people's self esteem. This comes down to people's social cognitions about how they view the world and view others. Okay. So, while given a specific area that people find themselves in, we can predict the behavior. The why they engaged in that behavior in the first place requires us to do more of a subjective examination. Okay. And again, I read through a lot of your introductions. I'll respond to them from the week one introductions. There's various reasons why you guys are at TOCC and you're in this class. Okay. And that's the point. Even though in this class we behave similarly in this situation, the reasons we're here is very diverse. Okay. And those are some of the lessons we're learning out of social psychology. The next one, so if I were to tell you, so when I got done with my bachelor's degree, I wanted to help the world. My bachelor's degree was in what's called experimental psychology, but it also had an emphasis on clinical psychology. So I right away after my bachelor's degree went into social services. And I went around to a lot of master counselors, master social workers, and I wanted to know, what do they use to help people? What do they use to really understand their clients and the people that they're helping? And in each office, there tended to be two really, really used books. Okay. The first one is kind of obvious. The first one was what's called the DSM, which is a Diagnostics and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association. This is where you get your billing code based upon symptoms that your client tells you about. You give a diagnosis. It's kind of the diagnostic manual. Some people have called it the Bible of counseling and clinical psychology and counseling and whatnot, because it tells you kind of, or informs you, I shouldn't tell you, it informs you about what psychological disorder or ailment your client has. But the second most used book in these counselors' offices were a developmental psychology book. Because what these counselors know is that you don't interact and treat people the same. It's just not possible. If you have a 6-year-old, a 13-year-old, a 24-year-old, a 54-year-old, and a 64-year-old, and they're all diagnosed based on the DSM with clinical depression, the way you approach these individuals will be different based upon their developmental experience. So the 64-year-old is going to be treated completely different than the 5-6-year-old, and everywhere in between. You take in their developmental period and their understanding of what they're going through in order to treat them. And that's what a lot of lifespan developmental classes is here at TOCC. We have Psych 240, Human Growth and Development, that is a course completely dedicated to human development. Because what we know is that we think different, we behave different, and we're physically different at different stages of where we are in the human lifespan. Okay. So developmental psychology is how we change and develop over time. So it is taking into account what happens in early childhood, where is their cognitive abilities, their emotional abilities, and how can we capitalize on them to help them get to the next stage of development, and so on. Okay. And this is developmental psychology. And they're going to introduce something called stage theory, which suggests that humans develop based on basic stages through life. We will challenge some of these ideas when we get to that section. But the idea is that we develop through different stages of our life. So, for example, we go through infancy, early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, teen years, young adult, middle adult, late adulthood. And these are different stages of life. Okay. So this is another aspect of psychology that we will go through while we're going through this class. Okay. The next two are really important. So I mentioned earlier that the behaviorist approach kind of broke down, and it broke down with a simple analogy of language. Okay. I mentioned B.F. Skinner was the poster child for behaviorist approach. Okay. So he wrote a very, and I'll admit, very convincing paper that we develop language through reward and punishment. Okay, that our language acquisition is because our parents rewarded us for certain sounds we made and punished us for certain sounds that we shouldn't make in a sequence of things that then developed into words, like ma versus me. So parents rewarded a child for ma, but not me. Ma, mama, yes, me, no. And so we go through this idea that it was a learned approach. Now, this he wrote this paper and he sent it in for review among linguists. So these are people who study language. And some of you may know him. He is actually a professor emeritus for the University of Arizona. He's more of a political writer than a linguist, but he put this paper out there for review, and this doctor said, you know, I just don't have time for this, so he gave it to a graduate student known as Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky. Now, if I want to give you the idea behind a review of a paper, usually a review of a paper is maybe a page, page and a half. Noam Chomsky went well beyond that. His rebuttal to B.F. Skinner was, I think, around 30 pages, where he totally tore apart behaviorist theory. And he went with a nativist approach, meaning that we're born with this certain inborn capacity to learn language, regardless of a reinforcement or learned history. We'll see that it's much more complex than that when we get to this section, but he argued that, you know what, basically, I'll give it this. This is the most basic example of Noam Chomsky's example. Between the age of 0 to 6. Now, I know most of you are going to go, I don't know that many words, but we're going to go with this. Between the age of 0 to 6, most children know over 60,000 words. If you think that that seems too much, trust me, there's other study that says it's an underestimate. Okay. Now, what happens after 6 is that we then start to weed off all of the words that we don't commonly use. So I would argue between the age of 6 and the age that I'm at right now, I went from 60,000 word to maybe a couple thousand. That's my guess based on my linguistic abilities. But so we weed them off after the age of 6. But by the age of 6, we know about 60,000 words. If we put those 60,000 words into sentences, we're talking millions of combinations of sentences that are potentially have meaning in that child's life. Okay. Now, I don't know about you guys. I do not remember my mom or my dad rewarding me 50 to 60,000 times between the age of 0 and 6 for every word that I said correctly. If any of you experience that much reward in your life, I praise you. You have angels for parents, but it seems pretty impossible. And Paige, yes, thank you for validating my experience. The idea that every word, every sentence, every sound that we make is rewarded or punished seems a little bit ridiculous because I don't remember getting that rewarded that much as a child. So that's the basic argument that kind of broke up this behaviorist manifesto and what started what is known as the cognitive revolution. And what the cognitive revolution is going to do is it's going to bring back the study of mental processes. But what it's going to retain is a scientific approach that behaviorists and people like Wundt and James introduced. They're not going to go back to that Freudian, more philosophical, these are potential structures of the mind. They're not going to go back to the deterministic theories of behaviorism and whatnot. They're not going to go in the realm of humanistic theory. They're going to say, when I'm studying something like decision making, I'm going to set up a scientific protocol that examines that decision making process. Okay. So this became the cognitive revolution. And we'll talk a lot about this throughout the course that kind of combines what we learned from behaviorism and cognition. And I will say this, if again, because most people relate psychology to counseling and treatment, if you want to know the gold star for treatment in for psychological disorders, it's called the cognitive, focusing on thinking behavioral approach, or CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy. So you're going to focus on the way people think about their world, and you're going to focus on the way people behave in their world, and you're going to help them alter their behavior or their thinking process. Okay, so that's kind of a clinical application of these two approaches. The last one now, I will say that the biological approach to study of the brain has been going on for centuries. For centuries, have we been studying, people with brain damage? We've tortured many mice and rats and primates by doing ablations in their brain to see what change in functioning has happened. But the biological approach really took off in the 1980s with it's actually two really new kind of scanning approaches that were refined. The first one is magnetic resonant imaging, which is MRI, which measures the electrical activity in the brain. Okay. And then the PET scan, which measures mostly the blood flow. Where is most of the blood flow going to in the brain, and how is that changing based on experience? These two brain scanning techniques, and then there's the EKG that measures electrical impulses as well, really launch what is called the biological or the neuroscience, social neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience revolution, where we started to realize that the brain is associated with every behavior and mental process we have. Okay. Now, this is where I do want to caution people because I'll talk a lot about different brain areas as we talk about different topics in the class. That brain imaging is not what do we call this? Cause and effect. Okay. An MRI study is not causal. It is associative. Okay. So when I say the amygdala is the seat of emotions, what I'm really saying is when you get angry, that area of the brain tends to become more active. I cannot say definitively that the amygdala causes anger. That's impossible, given our techniques of understanding and brain scanning technology. I can't say definitively that the auditory areas of the brain give way to hearing or just become active when you're hearing something. Okay. And so this is something that I do want to put a cautionary tale of, is that people talk about different brain areas, brain tracts, and everything like that. Remember that those are not causal, they're associative. They only become active when we're experiencing something. So they're associated with each other, but we cannot make any definitive statement about cause and effect. Okay. So I just want to bring that up because it tends to be, when we talk, I'm going to bring this up really quick. When we talk about things like depression is associated with low levels of serotonin, schizophrenia is associated with high levels of dopamine. Okay. We can't say that a person who has schizophrenia has a lot of dopamine in their brain, because the only reason we reach that conclusion is because medication uh, psychoactive medications reduce dopamine levels in the brain. SSRIs increase the level of serotonin, or antidepressant medications increase the level of serotonin in the brain. But we can't say that because the only way you can actually measure serotonin or dopamine or anything is post-mortem, where you slice the brain into very thin things, you put them under a microscope, and you could see the different configurations of neurotransmitters. So I just want to say this because the science of neuroscience, the science, and I see these things on Facebook where it says neuroscience has proven, neuroscience has done this. I want you as academics now to understand that we need to be very cautious about those studies because they can't prove cause and effect. And so I just want to put this out there. There's a lot of cool things that we've learned about the brain and its association with different mental and behavioral aspects, but neuroscience as a science is in its infancy. It's really only been around since the 1980s. It's younger than I am. So when we think about these things and you think the brain is cool, which it is, remember that the science of the brain is really, really in its infancy. So I just want to put that caution out there because we're going to bring up, starting tomorrow, we're going to be very much talking about biological psychology, the nervous system, and the brain. And so just remember this cautionary tale. So I do want to talk about, so we've talked about all these different theories, and I can define myself as a social psychologist. If I look at my master's degree, I can say I'm an industrial organizational psychologist. If I look at my bachelor's degree, I can say I'm experimental clinical psychology. But all of us, the majority of psychologists today take on what is known as the biopsychosocial model. That because we can't really determine which is more important or which is less important, we understand that we need to understand each aspect of the human experience in order to understand some psychological or mental process. Okay, so, and again, I'm going to go back to my dissertation. So I studied a social aspect of life. How does, when you think about your identity with other people, influence your level of loneliness? how much you feel isolated or how much you feel connected to human beings. Okay, that's what I was studying. This was kind of the star. But in order to understand these two things, I had to write a chapter on what is the neurobiology of loneliness and identity. Okay, where does, when you're thinking about being a student, when you think about being a parent, when you think about being a Native American or a European American or whatever it may be, even on that level, what areas of the brain are becoming active? What neurochemicals are becoming active during this period? Okay. When you're lonely, what areas of the brain are becoming active? And I'll tell you, in loneliness, your dopaminergic system comes because you want to become motivated to seek out social connection, but your serotonin level, your serotonergic areas, that emotional areas, the self-protective areas of the brain, because you don't want to experience this hurt of feeling isolated anymore. And so it's a counter emotion, both motivational, but also inhibitory. Okay. And then the other part is what is the psychological? What is it that keeps lonely people more lonely? And in my dissertation, I found that when you think about the positive aspects of your social identity, so this positive aspects of being a student, positive aspects of being a parent, positive aspects of being, whether you're in your 20s, 30s, or 40s, whatever it may be, why does that reduce our level? So why does thinking about our identity within our social world reduce a social phenomenon? Okay. And so this is what we think of in psychology. We don't just say a person experienced something because they were yelled at. No. When they experienced being yelled at, they had a psychological thought and they had a biological response. And it's the combination of all three of these that made them sad or made them angry and whatnot. So kind of keep that in mind. All right, I was hoping to keep this class short, but I do want to talk a little bit more about some movements in psychology that are really important, and that's the influence of culture. And I'm going to include in here the ideas of what's known as indigenous psychology. So, cultural psychology is the recognition that culture has a large influence on individuals' behaviors and mental processes. I mentioned, I think it was yesterday, that our brains are not fully developed in the womb of our mother. Our brains become more, do most of its growth in the social cultural context that we're born into. Okay, so culture has a large influence on our behaviors and our mental processes, and we'll get into that much more. The other thing that I hope you recognize as I've talked about this class so far is that it's been a very Western approach to understanding uh, life. We've reduced things to their most basic um, um, uh, concepts. But there is a growing thing, and this started in the 1980s here in the United States, known as indigenous psychology. Here in the United States, it's known as Native American psychology. In places that were colonialized, like here in the United States and Mexico and South America, Australia, this is also called post-colonial psychology. And what this recognizes uh, is that not everything can be reduced to a basic component, that things need to be explained more globally or more holistically. So In indigenous idea, the Western life has imposed upon them. So what is it that that Western society has done, and understanding the indigenous ways of being. So what is the goal of indigenous psychology? Well, we emphasize decolonization thought, that we need to think more holistically and less reductionistly, recognizing that individual experience and context matter. I mentioned this in the social psychology movement, but what indigenous psychologists are trying to do is, okay, social psychologists recognize the importance of the situation and individual experiences, but we also have to realize this in decision-making processes. We need to realize this in the arena of mental health and success, okay? And it understands the historical issues impacting current behavior and mental processes. You probably have heard the term historical trauma, which we will talk about later in the course, but the idea that not only do our lived traumas influence our behavior, but the people we belong to and their traumas matter too. And they are passed on either genetically or through historical stories and understanding. Um, and it brings back you, if you remember my introduction to Tana Otham, one of the Tana Otham theories is it brings back the concept of the soul into the psychology and doesn't reduce everything just to brain processes and physical processes, that there are things that influence us beyond our biology. Okay, so that's one aspect that I want to conclude with, but I do want to get through the many flavors of psychologists. So if you're wondering, well, my interest is this, and I don't know if it would fit in psychology, maybe we can find a fit for it. So psychologists were usually trained at a master's or a doctorate level, but I will tell you that most of our training is in method, knowledge, and theories of psychology. So if I were to take me as an experimental social psychologist, and I would take one of my clinical doctors, okay, both of us, out of the 90 doctoral credits that we got, okay, two-thirds, 60 to 70% of our doctoral degrees is in research methods and statistics. Only about 1/3 of those 90 credits, 20 to 30 of the credits, are in the topics, the social psychology theory, counseling theory. We're trained to use the scientific method to solve problems, okay? And within the clinical field, there are different ones. And so we have clinical psychologists who treat more severe psychological problems or do research on mental disorders. But we also have counseling psychologists. These are individuals that work in either a community mental health center, a school setting. They tend to treat more milder problems such as school and work troubles, relationship issues, those kinds of things. Now, clinical and counseling psychologists are PhDs, meaning they have doctorates in philosophy, or they have what's called PsyDs, which are doctorates in psychology. A psychiatrist is a medical doctor who treats mental disorders with psychotherapy or medication or surgery. Okay, so the difference between a clinical psychologist and a psychiatrist is a clinical psychiatrist spend their entire master's and doctorate experience studying mental illness. A psychiatrist goes and does their 4 years of medical doctorate training and then does 2 years of specialization to become a psychiatrist. Okay. And so that's kind of the major differences in these different fields at the doctoral level. But as I have mentioned from the beginning of this class, not all psychologists do therapy. So This is a list. If you look on the American Psychological Association's website, there's actually 52 different divisions of psychology. These are some of the major ones. I've mentioned experimental psychologists tend to do pure experimentation. They do things, they often will do things like reinforcement and those kinds of things on animals, those kinds of things. Social psychologists study, again, like I study, political psychologists. Most presidential or even Congress people or even senators tend to have what's called a political psychologist on their team. This is a person who kind of coaches the politician on what to say, how to say it to influence the political realm. Okay. Cognitive psychologists study decision making, intelligence. Behavioral psychologists study behavior, reward, and punishment. There are media psychologists, so they're psychologists who work with things like Facebook and with Netflix and on movie studios to really try and help with the human effect. Of course, each of these all have kind of a neuroscience perspective. Whoops. And then personality psychologists study individual differences, the differences between, you and the person sitting next to you. And then I'm going to go back up to here, IO psychologists, because some of these are practice psychologists. Some of them are pure researchers. A good example of pure research psychologist is an experimental psychologist. Outside of counseling and therapy, a good example of a practice psychologist is an industrial organizational psychologist, which is people who, for example, study anywhere about how to make a factory more efficient, given its human capital, to developing leadership. And I'm going to end with this story right here as far as industrial organizational psychologists. Is that I did my master's in IO psychologist and I studied with an individual. I didn't go down the right route. I did IO psychology in the nonprofit area, which isn't very high paying. But most IO psychologists are actually the highest earning. If you want to go into psychology and be making six figures within 1 or 2 years of graduations, I would do IO psychology. Because I had a friend who actually worked for the MGM Grand in Las Vegas. Okay, and I'll end with this about some of the things that some practice psychologists do outside of therapy and treatment. When I visited him, he was doing a research, and as you know, in the cool thing about casinos is that you can control everything. There's no windows in a casino. You control the lighting, you control the humidity, you control the temperature, you control time. There's not clocks and so it makes it almost like the perfect psychological lab. Okay. But what this friend was doing, and this was years ago, is the casino was dissatisfied because there was a hallway that went to the casino, but there was a lot of people who were just hanging out in the hallway. And they wanted to make it so people would move through the hallway into the casino quicker. So in his study, and this is an example of what IO psychology does, is he thought maybe, when you go to a mall and they're putting in a new shop, they do those build out walls where they build out a wall and it says on there, coming soon, TJ Maxx or something like that. Well, what he did is he did a series of fake walls where there was a build out wall and then there was nothing and then a build out wall because he felt maybe by shrinking the hallway, expanding the hallway, shrinking the hallway, it would make it so it would motivate people to move through it because it created this fluidity of change. Okay. So we had this series of build out walls, and yes, it actually to make the story short because we're almost out of time, it actually did increase the flow into the casino by about 20-25%. I helped them with a statistical analysis that was kind of fun, but it did increase the movement of people into the casino. So if you go to the MGM Grand, you'll notice that the hallways are not perfectly even. There tends to be a build out of something or a centerpiece somewhere. And the reason behind that is this psychologist showed that that will move people through that hallway quicker into the spaces that the casino wants them to be in. So that's an example of a non-clinical, non-academic way that psychologists work through different ways. Now, job market, I'll mention this really quick. Non-clinical jobs right now, the highest growth areas are in quantitative methods. So this is statistical analysis. This is a lot of the getting data from Facebook and all of those things and analyzing people's different behaviors. Neuroscience is obviously a big area. But after not after 9/11, after the pandemic, we've seen a huge growth in social and personality psychologists due to the isolation of the pandemic. There's a lot of people having a hard time re-socializing, re-understanding who they are as an individual. And a lot of companies and organizations have been concerned about this. So social personality psychology has been a growth area. The highest wage area, again, I'll say, is in the area of industrial organizational psychology. When we come to clinical psychology, you all know that there is a high need for counselors and therapists and clinical people and all this kind of stuff. We can see it. The unfortunate part about it is we can see it, we go for it, but unfortunately, in our capitalist society, we haven't figured out how to profit off of mental health and mental illness. And so while the demand is high, there's a lot of people compassionately going into the field. The job market is very flooded because of the few organizations that say, yes, we're going to invest in this. So high demand, but high competition due to the economics of taking care of people's mental health and mental illnesses. So that's where we are right now. I just finished at 1:15 again, but I want to make sure we can go on to our next topic and not dwell on this introduction part. So I'm going to kind of escape. All right. So I've stopped sharing. I'm going to ask really quick. Does anybody have any questions or comments for today? I went over time again today, but is there any questions or comments? Okay, thank you. Thank you. All right, everyone. It looks like the majority that answer. Let's go ahead and get out of here. I promise we won't go the full time, but I wanted to make sure we got through the introduction today. Take care of yourselves. Take care of your family. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, where we'll talk about our first quiz and our next topic. Take care, everyone, and have a wonderful rest of your day.